So most of you know me. I'll give you, for those of you who don't, a quick bit of my background. So like all of you, I went to Sheridan College, 3 years, architectural technology, co-op program, and then I worked for a little while. I was I graduated and I worked at the Toronto Community Housing Authority, which I hated the work, to be honest. I realized, actually I should have known back then, but I didn't really identify it this way, that I was not good in corporate culture. But I met one of my best friends there, so that was a good experience. And then through working there, I'm not sure how I got onto it, but I got put onto a job that was in Burlington for an architectural firm, and started working in a smaller, kind of mid-sized practice. Actually, Vito worked there too. I discovered after I came to Sheridan. And it was a good experience. I mean, good work experience, but because it taught me about the kinds of things that an architect's life might include. And the principal of the practice was good at kind of mentoring me, because he really did a good job of kind of including me in things that I showed interest in. So I did that, but I realized actually really quickly that I wanted to be an architect, because I could see the technologists around me, what they were interested in doing, and what I was interested in doing was what they were doing, but I also wanted to be involved in other kinds of things. So I eventually applied to and got accepted to U of T, went to U of T, studied architecture, and then graduated and worked at different firms. I worked at an interior design firm, some really small practice where we invented everything. It was a lot of fun, because if we decided that we wanted a faucet or a light and it didn't exist, we designed it and we had it made. And it was fantastic because my technical background really led me to be able to problem solve technically. So I could really work through any sort of design problem. But I also learned the relationship between clients and the things you want to make, and how do you kind of guide a client towards some of those choices. So that was also a good training, and I worked at other firms where that was the case as well. And then I eventually moved on to going back to working with a firm that was had won fewer awards, but I knew that they did residential work, and I really wanted to do residential work for my own kinds of reasons, of my own kind of personal history, that I wanted to do that work, particularly because I felt it wasn't being done well. So I was working in a practice and on a job where I was in over my head. I say this to students too, because it's sometimes kind of interesting to take on a role where someone gives you a task and you feel a little scared because you know you don't have enough knowledge to do it, but you fool them anyway, right? And you kind of work up enough courage and demonstrate enough courage, and you get it done. And you fall flat on your face sometimes, but it's okay. You kind of pick yourself up and you keep on going. So I was working on a building where it was a residential building, and I was having this conversation. We were trying to problem solve this problem of how to deal with stormwater on the building. And because we actually thought of the problem too late, the solution was going to be that we were going to manage the stormwater. We had this building that was 2 towers with a podium and this large landscape on top of a parking garage. And we had no place to store the water, the stormwater. So all that water was going to go in this massive pipe. It was like 900 millimeters round, and it was going to hang over top of the cars. You can't imagine a worse scenario than that, right? You've got something extremely heavy. Rather than putting it on the ground, you're going to hang it, right? So that was the only solution, and it was going to limit the headroom underneath those parking spaces. And then, so that was the answer, problem solved. But I remember thinking, I was the only one on the team, and I pulled the stormwater management engineer aside and said, doesn't this seem ridiculous to you? You've got all this water, that's water from a storm, and directly above us is a concrete floor with a massive landscape that needs water. And we've got all this water that we can't use to irrigate that thing. And it was ridiculous. And it was really just a bad solution. So when I was working in that same firm, a person that I had met years before came to me with a property and had said, I've got this property, I want to develop it, and because housing was on my mind long ago, like even before going to architecture school, I had all these ideas. So when he had said to me he wanted to do this, I had the problems of storm water as a way of solving it too. I knew immediately that I was not going to have the big pipe hanging in the parking garage as my solution for storm water. But I knew the city also wanted us to solve that problem. So I said immediately, well, what if we did this? We made a courtyard building, which I had for my own reasons, which my client liked, being from a European background. And we could create this landscape and then use the storm water to irrigate it, so that the water had a purpose, and we could kind of essentially create a cycle where water from the storm got collected and held, which the city wanted, and then we would use it to feed the landscape. And then also in this diagram that you see was a way of me thinking through the problem of circulation in buildings. That I didn't like the idea that a building had this experience where you were in a tunnel, no connection to the outside, and that if we changed how we move through buildings, that we could make it a kind of fantastic experience. So this diagram I made to show the relationship, the blue you see, of circulation to possibility of views. So that was an early idea. And here, that's a view from the corridor, looking out towards Dundas Street. And you can see how light plays in the space. And then also looking back from the street, you get this sense of something mysterious happening inside the building. That's not somebody's living room or a bedroom or anything else like that. So occasionally, if you were looking at the building, you would see a person pause there or walk through. So it always has this kind of bit of mystery that you see from the street. And that's the kind of opening, looking back at that same space we saw first. And other places where I was, again, interested in creating views that looked up to the sky and screen views looking back across what was an industrial neighborhood, really. So I didn't want people as they were kind of going to their unit looking at rooftops and mechanical equipment. So I screened the views and provided a kind of view to the sky instead. And it was successful. The building got published internationally. I did doors open building tours, and lots of people were talking about the building. And I was learning about what they were saying too. They were making comments, and it was interesting because I hadn't that point of view at times, and but I was also kind of reflecting on what it was that I was doing. So Globe and Mail and Toronto Star, to name kind of two papers, but there were other journals. But the problem was this. I was so eager to make that building, I didn't recognize the mistake I was making. I was working on a project, and I wasn't working on a practice. I was really thinking about how to make that project as best I could. But I hadn't asked questions about what happens after I'm done that project. I was just satisfied that somebody was letting me do the crazy thing I had in my mind. So I started asking my questions about, well, what's really the difference? And still today I do this. That when I'm thinking about a project, for me, projects fall into kind of a couple of basic categories. It might be a building. Sometimes that building is a theoretical building. I still, because of my early interior design experience, do industrial design work at times, if something interesting comes to my mind. And then I also will write as well. So that's another kind of form of creative practice for me. But that's really different than an architectural practice, where all of those things, writing, theoretical buildings, real buildings, industrial design, all amount to the same idea, possibly. That's the idea of making a practice. But all of those things should be feeding one another. They're not separate. They belong to the same category of creative thinking and making. And then that also feeds into how I think about it as marketing. And then the administrative part is also part of thinking through what's going on in practice as well. So it was this whole relationship of thinking about practice to project. And what did I learn about what I made as a project, and how could that translate into practice? What were the things that I did well, essentially, in that project that could inform my thinking about practice? And as I thought about that, really I started thinking about practice and the kind of three areas that I came up with that were really important to me and actually later on to clients as well, which was experience, first off, which we'll talk about next, firm size, which we'll talk about later. The third one, personality and trust, is always important, right? I mean, no one hires you unless they trust you to do the work. You show them a portfolio of work, the way you talk about it creates trust and suggests that you're going to fit, right? So I felt like actually I was okay on the part on number 3, that I got someone to make this building first off, and they trusted me enough to do it, and that we got along well enough that I could be trusted to do more. So I thought really item number 3 I was okay with. But the question really was about experience. You all have the same problem, which is the conundrum of job experience. To get the work you want, you need to have experience. And how do you get the experience, right? I wonder if you come up with any answers. Yes?
Work with somebody else first.
Yes, but sometimes even getting that job, right? The job you want, where you work for that particular person, sometimes is tough, right? How do you get to that job? How do you get, in some cases, the Canadian experience? So references, that definitely helps, right? But the truth of it is, but that's actually, the references are really fantastic for demonstrating item number 3, because that's where you say, your reference can't say, oh, he's got a bunch of job experience, because maybe you don't. But they can say, trust him. He will do well if you give him that opportunity. So definitely, item number 3 is like a must, right? And references definitely help convince somebody of that. But there is an answer to this question that I'll take you through later on. But I was also asking myself questions about how do I measure success? And it came up as a question for me because I realized actually I was doing it. My measure of success was not the same as others around me. So I have, you work in the industry long enough, you develop friendships with people who run practices or work in different other areas, and I realized actually that they were measuring success very differently than I was. And the OA will do this all the time. They'll pick a firm that they say is a kind of successful firm. And one of the things they'll demonstrate to say that they're successful is the numbers of people that work in the firm, right? You'll visit a firm and they'll say, oh, we've got 100 people on staff. Oh, no, we've got 200 people on staff. And so that's how they're measuring their success, by numbers of people. And I wasn't doing that at all. I had different measures. I was asking myself, what kinds of projects do I want to work on? What kinds of things will lead to success? And what goals for the work do I have? Because actually, what I was doing, what I really wanted was more of what I started off with, which was just a building to work on that was going to be fun, that paid me well, right? So I had that in that first project, and I wanted more of the same. Something that was going to be interesting to me and fun to work on, that paid me well, and that at the end of the day, to be honest, I had pride in the thing that I made. And that was how I was measuring success. So I started asking the same questions about clients, because ultimately that's what it takes. It's this relationship between your work and the client's work, and how were they measuring success? So I found that actually, when I thought about it from this point of view, the reason that so much housing was bad was that the people making housing didn't have the same measure of success that I did always. That they were measuring success by profit only, right? And that can really happen when you're not making a building for yourself. You're making it to be sold. It's purely speculation in that situation, right? So your measure is, how much money did I make? This building's more successful than that building because it made me more money. Well, I realized actually that wouldn't be the kind of person I'd want to work for, because they weren't using pride as a measure of success. I wanted somebody that when they finished a building, they could show it to their family and say, look what we made. Isn't that fantastic? 20 years, 30 years down the road, someone would say, who made that? And then they would feel pride about saying, I did. And that's what was a measure for choosing. And I really wanted to make sure that at that point, when I started to understand that I was communicating to clients who had the same sensibility. Because I realized actually in that first client relationship for that building, that's what got him to move towards the things I wanted. I could demonstrate that he could still make money, as much money as he thought he would make early on, but he would still feel pride in the thing that he made. So that we weren't sacrificing profit necessarily. We just weren't trying to make every single dollar that we might, but we'd still have this sense of accomplishment when we were done. And that was important in my messaging to my clients. So the part of thinking through this problem of your reputation and what that really means. And for me, that translates into this one simple way of thinking about it, that your experience is your reputation, and it's part of your talent. So when I was thinking about experience and trying to get the next job, I had this problem because I had built this one building that I wanted. The other residential buildings I had built with other people, but it wasn't what I wanted to show. So if I was asking you to hire me as a client, really what I needed to do was to show them other buildings that I made that I didn't really like, which created this problem of what do I continue to show? How do I demonstrate what I want to make and also demonstrate experience? So that was the kind of issue. And part of how I came to the answer was with Malcolm Gladwell's help. He is, you might say, a cultural theorist. Canadian, writes for I think, New Yorker. And this book really looks at, Outliers, his book, looks at the story of success, which is really to look at exceptional individuals, who we think is exceptional. And he breaks it down and says, you know what, this guy, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, they had exceptional circumstances. They're not necessarily, they had talent, which is actually the smaller measure of what makes someone successful. You all have talent in different areas. Discovering your talent is one important thing, but really there are a bunch of different ingredients for actually becoming an outlier or a success story. And one of the things he points to is this rule of the 10,000 hours. So in the book, I'll give you two examples of people that came up. One were a group, first the Beatles, and this is the quote from them. In Hamburg, we had to play for 8 hours. And the rule of 10,000 hours really is simply this, that you have to have enough practice to become good at it. And at the point that you've got that, and this is the kind of round number of 10,000 hours, then actually not only are you good at the thing you're wanting to do, but people start to know you to be good at that thing. So with the Beatles, they were this band who just got together shortly after high school and living in Liverpool, I believe, and they encountered this bar owner from Hamburg that wanted to bring rock and roll to Germany. And part of doing that with his audiences was to have, and his business idea was to just have rock and roll or music being played constantly. So the group, they basically had to play 8 hours straight. And if you've ever been to a concert, to play, for that period of time is hard. And most often, if you're a new band, you don't have enough music to fill 8 hours. So you're playing other people's music as well. So they were doing this, and they were quickly accumulating their 10,000 hours, you might say. And and during that time, they were learning about different genres of music, incorporating that into their own music, and discovering their relationships and what each offered to that creative enterprise. So they got really good, and after that kind of Hamburg experience, their career kind of took off. So it was getting that early experience together. The other story is with Bill Gates. He's great in grade 8. He is privileged, and he has this, but his privilege gives him the opportunity to work with mainframe computers in grade 8, and then all the way through high school. So before most people in universities have mainframes that they're working on, he is getting time hour after hour, and he loves it so much that he's throwing in his 10,000 hours. Before he's even in university, he has almost his 10,000 hours. So by the time the PC comes out, he has tons of computer programming experience, and he can see the potential in a PC, and turns that into a success story. But it's not just him. In the book, he describes other situations like Steve Jobs and countless others, where it's about getting that kind of early experience. In a place that you might not think might lead to your later success story, but first kind of developing that experience. So really, that was the answer. I needed to demonstrate I needed time to kind of grow both professionally and establish a reputation in the work and the things that I was interested in. So that's really what it was. It's demonstrate the things I did well. And this was apart from scale in some respects. So what I really discovered that I was interested in was this relationship between buildings and landscape, and that I could continue to work on through that problem. I didn't need a 6-story building necessarily to do that. I could do that in smaller areas. I could do that in a house. I could do that in a smaller multi-residential building. But that I could continue to work through that problem of how landscapes continue to transform buildings. It's the winter scene of the same building, and then summer. So that all of these things, that as an idea, could be the thing that I continue to try to demonstrate. But it was also, and this is the advantage that I think my education brings, both having a technologist background and architectural background, is that when I encountered problems like this one, for instance, where I was trying to make a landscape on top of a large roof, before green roofs were really popular, I hired a green roof company, and working with them, I learned their technique or their kind of science around making green roofs, so that I could take it and make it myself without their help, and apply it at half the cost to other buildings I would make. And that was, to my mind, my technologist mind at work. And the other thing that I realized I think I did well was being able to think through complex problems and demonstrate that to a large group of people where we could all kind of work through that problem. So in that sense, this project takes, at a smaller scale, took some of that way of making landscapes so that I could think of it as a system that fed itself. So that this landscapes that are a part of this building are constantly being fed by water off the roof, and it's a kind of system that was easily, like it's a kind of cycle, so that it requires no kind of major intervention. And it also, because I understood how to make it simply, I could not include that green roof company, and I could make it myself. And I could give the contractor strict instructions about how the system was going to work, even if when they didn't understand it, I did, so that I could force that idea into the building at not much extra cost. And it has become the way that I continue to work through problems. But it also had this benefit of, like, spaces inside, and all of that way of thinking through problems continues to be the strategy. So another small multi-residential building, this is 3 units. So it leads to the kind of next part of it. So the idea of reputation is to kind of grow it slowly, doing the things, that's what I decided, that I would grow it slowly, doing the things that I wanted, and never show the projects that didn't make me happy as a way of just getting experience, and that it would just take some time. But it leads to the kind of next part of the kind of thinking through practice, which was firm size. And I knew that actually overhead was the kind of biggest inhibitor to working slowly and having possibly fewer projects. But because that would be the case if I had this kind of way of working that wasn't conventional, I would probably have fewer projects. And I knew that I needed, from my perspective, to keep the overhead down. And now it had this benefit. If you thought about it like this, that having a large firm means that you have to have more staff, more place to place that staff in an office, and that to do that early on, my friends, I saw what they were doing. They were basically taking money and investing early on into their practices. So, but I was looking at that and thinking, really, what's the return on my investment? If I take a bunch of money, put it into renting office space, paying for staff, managing the ups and downs with shareholder equity that happen in a practice where your cash flow is going up and down, a new practice that is, right? And this is not just architectural practices, it's engineering practices, it's law practices that are brand new, basically that fee-for-service model. So I knew that that return on investment didn't really make a whole lot of sense. Why wouldn't I take that money and put it in the stock market or the real estate market in other ways? So the idea of putting out a bunch of cash to make, to create a kind of high overhead situation didn't make sense to me. So I thought, let's keep the overhead down lower and see what other models I could come up with. So part of what I knew earlier on too was that these three measures, the optimization ratio, the utilization rate, and the break-even rate would all be better if I could keep my overhead lower. So let's look at them. The optimization ratio is this measure of, this is the income, the net income coming into the business. And that net income has to basically take care of these three categories. Direct labor, which is the kind of traditional model. Overhead, and overhead is like office space, and then obviously profit, because you need the profit to kind of keep the business going. You invest in other things with that profit, or you add that back to the kind of principal owner of the business. So all these things were important to the business, and that was a measure I was looking at in the kind of traditional model. But I discovered that actually the small business model is very, very different. You keep your overhead lower, and profits can stay the same, or in fact possibly increase. Or you decide, and you start to do something a little bit different. You start using contract labor, which allows you to keep the numbers of employees inside the business smaller. So it has a lot of other benefits as well that we'll kind of talk about. But essentially that I would hire people as I need them on contract to do different tasks. And what I discovered when I was getting published in this magazine, which is like a national magazine that looks at sustainable architecture, and in talking with the editor, I thought, okay, the journal is published out of Montreal, that's where the editor was. But then the editor put me in contact with the writer, and the writer was in Vancouver. And the writer said, okay, now you need to talk to the graphic designer. And the graphic designer was in another part of Quebec. And I realized, wow, this national magazine has the same business model that I do. They're using contract labor. That writer didn't just write for this magazine, he wrote for other magazines. And he was really pleased to be doing that, having that kind of contract relationship with the magazine. The graphic designer, she did graphic design work for other journals and other kinds of areas. So, and they didn't share office space. So they were following this idea of a contract labor business model that allowed them all a bunch of flexibility and benefits. Now, it's a kind of changed world in some respects, because many of you have probably parents that work in direct labor markets, which is to say they're employees with pensions possibly, and have full-time jobs that they go to, and they work exclusively for that employer. But more often, the case will be that many more of you will work in contract labor situations. And we can continue to lament the loss of pension plans, or create your own, and decide that actually you can be more responsible for your own work by thinking about it more as kind of contract labor. I said this to the last group, and I'll say it to you too, that's the difference, right? RAM is direct labor, I'm contract labor, right? And it both have benefits. And definitely to my business, it has tons. So the other benefit to thinking about contract labor is the utilization rate. The utilization rate measures basically when I'm working on something, I say, I've got 40 hours in a week that I'm working on something, how often are the people in my business working on projects? Or are they working on something else? Well, in larger businesses, mid-sized businesses, that utilization rate is more like 60%. So it means that you've got either support staff that are adding hours to your overall hour total, but they're not working on projects. And it's increasingly true for your practitioners as well. If you're running a practice, your utilization rate is around 60. And bigger the practice, less it is. So that you're, in lots of cases, in larger practices, it may even be 40%. Now, to my mind, that went totally against the fun, right? I didn't find being an administrator fun. I wanted to work on projects. That was what was, to my mind, what was success earlier on. That I would continue to work on projects. So the idea that the utilization rate was lower with the contract labor model always made sense to me as well. 85% of the time, I could be actually working on a project, and that was better for me as well.
So what are the kind of things that you contract to deliver?
Well, the contract labor that I'll often do is things that I don't have enough skill to do. So that might be a photographer, a publicist. In some case, I'll hire someone to kind of be kind of editor when I'm working on an article. I'll also hire like drafting help as well, right? So I choose businesses that they're also doing other things, right? If they're going to provide contract labor architectural services to me, they're also doing that for others, and they're also making their own projects, right? So it's why some students in the past said, will you hire me? I thought, you'd have to decide you want to be your own business person as well. That you would have to decide that actually, I'm not turning you into an employee. You have a lot of autonomy on your own. And that's why a class like this is good for you, I suspect, because that is the future of work. And we shouldn't lament the loss of direct labor, because direct labor also has this very big downside that Karl Marx identified a long time ago, right? Is that if I'm a capitalist and I own the company, at some point, there's only two ways for me to make more money. I either have to charge more, or I have to pay everybody less. Right? So what do you think happens in a direct labor market? At some point, the employees there's going to be more and more pressure to pay them less. Right? Where it's the direct labor market, if you're selling your services, then you have more control of it. Just like the owner of the larger corporation, you control your labor rates far better, and you control your expenses. So you can control a little bit more what you get paid. But it does mean you need to know how to run a business. Right? All the kind of administrative stuff that I'm not talking about is what you also need to know. Right? But and this is part of it. This break-even rate is looking at that and understanding that actually in the in the contract labor model, it means that I've got less need for office space. I can have a smaller space, and then my break-even point is sooner. Soon I get to a point where I'm making profits sooner under this model. So the question then becomes, well, I've talked about this model from my point of view, which seems advantageous. Well, how do clients see it? And the question, and this is really how I've come to understand it, that a client likes the idea of a larger firm and a larger workforce because, for one thing, it suggests to them that when they come to you, they will see that you've got enough employees to kind of complete their project. They don't mind handing you yet another project and another project because you seem to have a workforce large enough to be able to complete those projects. So it creates a sense of confidence that way. And also it suggests that the business is healthy. If you've got that many employees, that the business is creating enough revenue that it suggests a kind of healthy business. And that's important because the last thing you would want if you were a client, that your architectural practice or engineering practice or law practice goes bankrupt halfway through the project, right? Not a good situation. So you'd have to say, so a healthy business is important to a client for sure, but it also suggests technical capacity to kind of do the work. All those people amounts to minds that contribute to making sure that the work gets done well. So from a client's point of view, how do you answer those questions in the model that I'm proposing or that I'm working from? And the answer, to my mind, is always simple. It always comes back to the thing that clients want most, right? The experience. We keep on asking for it, and it's because it's actually really valuable. It's because it answers all those questions. The workforce capable of doing the work, well, if I just demonstrated that I did all these other projects, then I'm demonstrating that I have a workforce capable of doing the work. You may not understand the business model if you're a client that uses a direct labor model, and they're looking at me as a contract model, but keep on demonstrating that you're doing the work and executing the work, and it answers that question. Same thing with the health of the business. More work being completed, more work being proposed, more work being discussed in journals suggests too that the business is healthy. And then last, technical capability, well, that's also the same, it's answered by the completion of the work as well. You execute the work, you suggest that you're technically capable to move it through approvals and into construction and to being closed. So all of those things really amounts to just more experience. And as I said, the publications are another way of creating reputation and credibility, and then more importantly, just continuing to complete work, and at different scales. So currently in practice, there's a mid-rise building that I'm working through, and because there's far more clarity about the relationship of building to landscape, the building starts off in its very early ideas as having this sense of both building and landscape that come together. And it yet again demonstrates this working through that firm size is not really encumbrance to thinking through any of these problems. That in fact, even in larger firms that I've worked on, that you can be one person working on 5 projects, and then the 6th project comes to your desk, and you don't have the time to do it. So that idea of having a large staff doesn't necessarily mean you've got more capacity to take on the work. Or that you're, in lots of large firms too, you've got a lot of junior staff possibly, and they're asked to do things that they may not, that may be over and above their experience levels. So even the idea of technical capability is not necessarily true in a larger firm. So completing the work is always the kind of biggest demonstration for all of those questions that are being asked, to my mind. So that's the kind of brief tour of my practice and the way that I approach it. Any questions? Yes.
So what were some challenges you faced when your business model was the contract labor?
Well, it really was about firm size, right? And I also needed to demonstrate, because if I wanted to, I could do smaller buildings and do that well, and people would accept that a smaller firm could do that. But if I want to do multi-residential buildings and more complex buildings, then I need to demonstrate that firm size is not wouldn't be the thing that would stop me from doing that work. So it's actually, to my mind, it's the way that the future will work, right? I just said to you, Sheridan does this. Sheridan has an ideal model for contract labor versus direct labor, right? So does other institutions. And even large businesses are thinking through this problem. That's why I say all of you will find yourself, fewer of you will be in direct labor situations. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. If you have a mind for business, because you can make it an advantage to you. So that was the kind of early hurdle. But like I say, it's overcome by just completing more and more work and having that work published and talked about.
You were talking before about how when you were working with a firm and you were comparing yourself with what you wanted versus what the technologists were doing, you didn't know from the beginning you wanted to be an architect, did you?
I knew I wanted to make stuff, right? To be honest, when I first started doing that, I thought because of my dad's influence that engineers were better than architects. I didn't know what that meant. Because, even still today, if you ask your parents or just kind of friends, engineers have have a status that's, thought of as being important, right? So I thought I wanted to be an engineer. And there was a point where I had gone, but I wasn't certain about that. So I came here and then worked for a while. And that firm that I said that I worked at the year after graduation, it was there that I really kind of discovered, because the principal of practice was giving me tasks that made me think, okay, I can do this, and it's fun. I was having fun doing it. I still like doing the technologist stuff, but I was having fun working on problems with him that was suggesting to me that I had the mind to do that as well. And then the other thing that I did, because I was deciding that I was going to apply, but still to engineering school, because that's what my dad wanted. And so I went and visited an engineering school in Windsor. And it was environmental engineering. And I discovered actually, they had this, it was quite cool. They had this big wave tank, room as big as this. It's created a simulated shoreline. And they were trying to think through a problem of how to use recycled tires. And they created a kind of break wall and shoreline with tires. And they were cascading waves against this wall that they had made out of tires. And although I thought it was really interesting, I thought it was ugly. And it wasn't just because like it's just an idea of beauty, but it was also about experience, right? I thought, who's going to walk next to that wall? Who's going to walk, like here you are, you've got this possibly a big body of water that would attract people, but who would want to walk next to this landscape that you're making of tires? And that there needed to be another layer of thinking. The engineers were really valuable, but the way that I wanted to think about that problem was yes, from an engineering point of view, but also from a point of view of experience and beauty and all those other kinds of things. And that best described an architect. So once I understood that, I thought, thank you for the University of Windsor for teaching me that lesson, and then I applied to architecture school. And that was really what made the difference. At that point, I really started to learn what I could expect in terms of thinking through problems in work and what the difference would be between an architect and a technologist. But I'll say this, I said it to the last group too, and so I should say it to you, is that that problem of thinking about that shoreline is not solved only with the architect's mind. Okay? It's solved with the technologist's mind. Because at some point, those tires have to get assembled together. How do we fasten multiple little units of tires together that have never been put together in this way? There is a point of, how do I screw them together? Do I glue them together? Do I weave them together like a basket? That's, to my mind, a technologist's way of thinking through the problem. And it has implications about beauty, cost, all those kinds of things that you work through at the macro scale apply right at that point where you're putting two tires together. And that was really, to my mind too, working through practice, using both ways of seeing the problem. And to be honest, to make something interesting and unique and fun, you approach the problem and you arrive in the same place. But you may start from one end, the kind of detail or the kind of macro way of thinking about it, but you arrive at the same place. You have to kind of finally make it.
Oh, yep.
Yes?
So when you were lowering, I guess, your overhead cost, did that not imply that you had to do more work by yourself and then contract out the majority of the stuff that you didn't know to other contractors or whatever?
No, I think of it like this. Like if I've got a 40-hour work week, right? There's only one of me, and I'm not going to turn myself into an 80-hour work week, right? So, because that wouldn't be fun. And like I say, that's a measure of my success. So all of a sudden I'm working like a dog to get things done, but I'm not having fun and I have to change something. So, or if I'm working too few hours and not making enough money, then I'll have to change something. So with that measure of success, I can always use it as a way of evaluating. So I'm always saying, I've got 40 hours, what do I want to do? What don't I want to do? I can give to somebody else who wants to do that, right? So it means that more increasingly what I find is that I want to do the front-end stuff, the stuff that's solving the problems of how all of these 12 issues combine into one building, into one site, right? That's the thing that, to be honest, clients appreciate more and more that is difficult to do. It's creative thinking. And if you listen to others, other cultural theorists like Richard Florida, he says that as the world changes and technology causes people to lose jobs, that creative thinkers will continue to have work because it's not a problem you can automate. You can't take 12 different points of concerns and have, not yet anyway, a machine think through the problem and give you a single solution. Right? And that's valuable. And so it means that people who work in our industry continue to be highly employable. And that's where I keep my work. So if I decide that a detail is really important to the building, believe me, as I'm drawing the overall mass of the building, like the example of this building here, I've already sketched the landscape edge detail. I already know how that works. I don't know, to be honest, how many units are in this building. but I know that detail. Because that detail is necessary to pull off a basket with hair growing out of it, right? If you want to see the building that way. So that detail becomes necessary to thinking through the problem. So that's what I do. But there's a stair detail in here somewhere, right? For the exit stair. I'm not going to draw that.
What's the cladding material?
The way that I work is that I don't know. Because I postpone certain questions. I know that I want something that's this tone of color, that creates this feeling, that is matte, but that could be stone, it could be panels, it could be precast. So I leave all of those questions for later on, and then I'll decide them as I move forward through the project. And I give that material a series of criteria to respond to. So it means then I leave it open to a bunch of different things. So when value engineering happens, which happens in all buildings, then we can say, no, not that material, but this material that costs the same because it satisfies these aesthetic criteria, right? Or construction criteria. So for instance, if I wanted to make, as I'm showing there, a really thin parapet at the top where it meets the landscape, that certain materials are going to allow me to do that more than others. So that might exclude one material versus another.
Nope.
Yes.
How are you managing the contract laborers?
Well, part of what it is too is that I get to use the same people over and over again. So my photographer, I've used him on multiple projects, so he knows when he encounters me that there is, I have a strong idea about what I want to photograph, because I'm trying to tell a story through pictures. So like this photograph, for instance, was, I described to you a narrative of circulating through the building. So I pulled the photographer to this point and said, I want an image that tells this story. You know, and then he works with me to kind of make it as beautiful as we can. Right? So, but it's part of that contract labor model is to still use the same people as often as you can. So you still have a relationship with them, right? But it also means too that I support them in any way that I can, not just with my own work, but I might recommend someone else to them, because I understand that their small business if it's healthy, then my business will be healthy. And it's a kind of collaboration, and it's a constant collaboration. But it also makes it work well this way, because this person, this photographer is not my employee, he feels confident enough to say, no, David, that's a bad photograph, right? And he has said that to me in the past. I really want that photograph. He says, why? That's not good. Or my publicist would say, that's not clear. That sentence is horrible, right? And it's that kind of relationship that comes with a kind of distance, you know, that I think is valuable, that you may not necessarily do in a direct labor model nearly as well.
Thank you, David. Yep, let's give David a